Well, I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I was looking forward. I actually just rolled in about an hour ago, but I'm here tomorrow, and I think I'm on the schedule to interact with a bunch of you, and I'll be here after the talk. I'd love to chat more with you about ecology, conservation biology, rare species conservation, graduate school, anything you want to talk about. So please hang around afterwards if you have interest. I'm particularly delighted to be here because, as Joy Brinkerhoff just mentioned, he was my first graduate student, and so it always holds a special place. And we worked together, as Joy said, for about a dozen years. It's always a little dangerous to dig out old slides from the field of your old graduate students, but I did manage to find one, and it's not too incriminating, but here he is, checking his small mammal traps, and maybe some of you, I actually hope you do get a chance to go out into the field with him in the coming years. He knows a lot about those mammals, to tell me a lot, because I am not a mammal biologist. I thought I would just start by giving you a little background from where I'm coming from, and as Joy mentioned, the species that I love the most are the butterflies, and I happen to study what are literally the rarest butterflies left in North America or on the face of the earth. And I do love the butterflies, even though I won't talk entirely about butterflies today. But I want to tell you about a few of their plights, just to give you a sense for my perspective. So I'm going to tell you about three of them. The first I'm going to tell you about is the St. Francis satyr butterfly. This butterfly it's got a really strange habit. It lives in abandoned beaver ponds. So beavers create ponds. Those are, literally flooded with water. Then they abandon them or they're killed. And then behind that pond comes in a wetland vegetation that this butterfly is found in. Now, it's a peculiar butterfly because this is its entire global range found in blue on this map. If you squint, you can see it. There it is. It's found at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, literally found only at this military base. Now, what happened is what we think happened is through the range of this butterfly, beavers were exterminated. So 100 years ago, all beavers were eliminated from the landscape, eliminating this source of disturbance that regenerates the butterfly's habitat. But the butterfly hung on at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. And we think the reason why is that shortly after beavers were exterminated, the Army base was created and the military started bombing. And this butterfly is most abundant right around the places where the military drops bombs. I mean, it's really fascinating. They don't live where the bombs actually land, but the bombs every year start fires. So imagine it like a donut. The bomb lands at the donut hole, and then the donut itself is burned every year. And in really dry years, those fires would burn through wetlands and keep back the shrubs and trees that would shade out the butterflies' food plants, the grasses that the butterflies eat. By the way, I didn't realize, but Steve Roble is here. He works at the State Natural Heritage Program and works on the other subspecies of this butterfly that's also endangered and happens to be found, among other places, in the mountains of Virginia. Okay, so that's butterfly species number one. Here's butterfly species number two. This is the crystal skipper butterfly. It's this is the best case scenario for this butterfly. This is my former graduate student, Allison Leidner, looking out at this butterfly's habitat. It lives on a 30-mile stretch of beach. Actually, not on the beach, but if you come right up off the beach, there's the sand dunes that occur right before maritime forest. And it's in this football field at most wide stretch of dune that would historically have extended 30 miles down the beach on North Carolina Barrier Islands that this butterfly is found. Now, by the way, before you start accusing me of choosing cushy field sites to go do research in, I will tell you that this is the most excruciating place I have ever worked. it's hot. So you got like 100-degree heat coming from above. Then you've got the sun reflecting off the sand up into your face, so it's hot coming from below. And the whole time you're out there catching butterflies, you're watching people on the beach having fun. I mean, this is an excruciating place to do field work. But whereas this is the best case scenario for this butterfly, dune habitat, actually the food plant for the caterpillars is the area that's basically brown on this map. It's the grass that the butterfly eat, caterpillars eat. This is what much of the butterfly's habitat looks like now. This is like ground zero for beachfront development. And so if any of you spend time on the North Carolina coast, that's Atlantic Beach on the left. And then you got people that build their houses, I mean, literally right on top of the butterfly's habitat. I mean, these are the people, I mean, often when you go to beach houses, you have to walk across the boardwalk and through the dune to get to the beach. But these are the people that, like, they want to be able to roll off their front deck onto the beach in the morning and not have to walk too far. So this is what's happening to a lot of the butterfly's habitat. Okay, third butterfly. This is one I just started working on in the last year, the Miami blue butterfly. Now the Miami blue butterfly is an interesting one. It's where it occurred was basically in the entire range of this picture. This is South Florida. So we've got like Miami's here, Everglades is here, so South Florida, and then out in the Keys. This butterfly was essentially a weedy butterfly. I mean, it was found everywhere throughout this range. But over the past 4 decades, its populations have declined dramatically. It's declined so dramatically that when I went to see this butterfly for the first time in September last year, I had to get on a plane, fly to Miami, then get in a car, drive 150 miles to Key West, then get on a boat and take this boat 10 miles out across the Bay of Florida to this tiny little island. I mean, literally, it was like a couple football fields in size, out in the middle of essentially the middle of the ocean, where the butterfly remains. I mean, there's almost no populations of this butterfly left. Now, I tell you about these butterflies partly because I love butterflies, and I'm really fundamentally concerned about these butterflies in particular. I mean, these butterflies are at risk of being lost from the face of the earth. But I'm telling you about them as well because they're like my poster children, so to speak, for the fate of biodiversity more generally. And we can talk about plants, we can talk about animals, insects like butterflies. By many metrics we could use, biodiversity, the diversity of species on Earth is being lost. And what's common to all these butterflies, one of the key threats for them is the loss of their habitat. And so where I want to start in getting to talk about the experiments that will be the main focus of my talk is that the key problem that my lab addresses is the problem of habitat loss. I'd like to start with this slide. I mean, this literally could be any slide from any place on the face of the earth. But it shows the forests of eastern North America in green from basically the time of European colonization through to 100 years ago. And I work in an ecosystem called longleaf pine savanna. Longleaf pine savanna would occur from Texas around the southeast up to maybe southern Virginia. And what you see in this slide, and like I said, this could be like any other place in on Earth, is that by 1920, it's hard to distinguish the forest that remains from the specks of dust on my slide. Most of the habitat has been lost. And I need to tell you about a further problem. It's not just that the habitat has been lost. Oh, sorry. Ooh, too many buttons here. Okay. This slide describes the other part to my problem. So this is another forested landscape. This one, again, could be lots of places on the face of the earth. It happens to be from central Wisconsin, an oak forest. And what it shows is as European people of European descent spread across the landscape from the 1830s to 1950s. It shows the landscape being converted to agriculture. And so what you see, like in my last slide, is that most of the habitat has been lost. But the habitat that remains isn't one big, nature preserve right in the middle of the frame. Rather, the habitat that remains are small, tiny areas of forest that are spread out across the landscape. These are woodlots that are separated by big agricultural fields. And so the key problem is not just that habitat's been lost, but that it's been fragmented into tiny parcels. And so the issue with that is that, and many of you might know this from population biology, you get small areas of habitat like this. They support small populations, and small populations are highly threatened with extinction for all sorts of reasons that we could talk about. They're more exposed to catastrophe. We know there are many genetic factors like inbreeding and genetic drift that are more apparent in small populations. Those populations are at risk. And so people like me, conservation biologists, ask, given that habitat's been lost and fragmented, how can we overcome the negative effects of habitat loss? And so I point back to this classic paper by Ed Wilson, famous Harvard ecologist, and Ed Willis, a student, who took principles from ecology, basic theoretical principles of ecology, and used them to ask, how should we conserve landscapes in the ways that will best preserve the diversity of species that we want to protect? And so what they did is they said, look, given that we're going to conserve our funds are limited, we're going to conserve a certain amount of habitat area. What are the better ways to conserve landscapes, and what are the worst ways to conserve landscapes? And so they said, well, it's better to conserve one big nature reserve than to conserve a whole bunch that are widely separated from each other. It's better to conserve one more compact shaped nature reserve than one that's kind of spread out through the landscape. And it's better, and this is the focus of much of my talk, it's better to connect areas of habitat that remain with what we'll call landscape corridors than to leave them separated from each other. And so the focus of my research and much of my talk today is on these landscape corridors. And so just to give you a sense for what these landscape corridors are, these landscape corridors range from small areas that you could find around Richmond, or I can find around Raleigh or around Duke, to really large areas. So I'll show you some examples and tell you how they're used. This is an example of a corridor, this light green area, hopefully you can see that in the back, is a corridor that connects Duke Forest, so this is forest next to Duke University, to open space in the county. And the local land conservancy spent $100,000 to conserve this corridor. And by the way, just so it's clear, the idea behind these corridors is that they'll be superhighways for plants and animals, that they'll be able to use them to move through the landscape and have access to more area of habitat than they would without the corridor there. And I'll talk to you later about how these corridors actually work. But that's an example of one that you might find, along the river, along the James River, or in lots of places that are more local examples of corridors. But at larger scales, corridors look like this. This is an example of an exercise to identify corridors across the state of California. And so a group of conservationists and government organizations and people involved with transportation identified 232 corridors that they thought would be good to conserve, to reconnect landscapes for wildlife. Now, and this is true with a lot of conservation planning. A lot of this is pie in the sky, just lines on a map that people drew for an idealized conservation plan. But I can tell you that in the densest part of California, between LA and San Diego, the state has paid tens of millions of dollars to conserve 19 of these corridors for mountain lions and spotted owls and other big animals, and then hoping that other smaller things will also use these corridors. And then this is the grandfather of all corridors. This is the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor. It extends from Yellowstone National Park, which is down here, 1,800 miles north to the Yukon Territories. And what this map is showing is the yellow outline here is the corridor conservation area. Now, not all the land is conserved. The green areas are conserved here. the dark green areas. The lighter green areas are places that conservation biologists would like to conserve. So it's a work in progress. But I can tell you that the Nature Conservancy last year spent $500 million to reconnect habitats in this landscape. And by the way, these people, they take their corridors incredibly seriously. So, there are places here that are mainly forested landscapes. This is Jasper and Banff National Parks in Canada. I don't know if any of you have been there, but a really cool place if you have a chance to visit. And I know it's a really cool place because I happened to make a visit there last year with my pilgrimage to the, prime example of a corridor. And most of this landscape is forested, but in the places where it's not forested, and there's just a few places, but where this interstate runs through the landscape, they've made a concerted effort to reconnect the forests on either side of the interstate. So if you look at this, if you squint and look at this overpass behind me, that overpass has an incipient forest growing on the top with saplings that are about this tall, and it's meant to be a forested overpass that promotes connectivity for big things like grizzly bears and elk and moose. And there's not just one of these. There's literally dozens of overpasses and underpasses that are being built to reconnect this landscape. Now, the idea for making these corridors has been a popular idea in conservation for about 3 decades. And it's been popular because the idea has been supported by theory, and it kind of makes sense. We eliminated habitat, we fragmented landscapes, now we should reconnect them if we want to conserve wildlife. But if it's been popular in the past, just generally, now because of the powerful interaction between habitat loss and climate change, these corridors are actually becoming more popular. So let me tell you why. And bear with me a second. This is my conceptual diagram of species ranges. So that's what these green blobs are. And here I'm going south to north in latitude. So we expect species ranges to shift north as climate warms, that is, so they get to expand their ranges to cooler areas. And my schematic here has natural areas that are white, and then some places that habitat's been lost that are in gray, or this roadway going through that fractured the landscape. And the idea with the interaction of climate change and habitat loss is that as species ranges move northward to track climate change, if there are these breaks in the landscape, ranges won't be able to shift for most species. The only species that will be able to make it are those species that disperse really well and are generalists, that is, can live in many different kinds of habitats. And the species that are more specialists or limited in their dispersal ability won't be able to change their ranges and will be lost. And so the idea with corridors is that you add some kind of connection to the landscape, either for some kinds of species, these road overpasses, so small connections, or for others, you might need big, long corridors that allow ranges to spread, and that provides a passageway for plants and animals to make it through the landscape. And one thing, my lab group did an analysis recently that showed current parks and reserves are generally small, and they aren't able to accommodate range shifts that are predicted for many plants and animals. And so we have to be looking to these landscape scale conservation strategies to allow species move their ranges. And so, like I said, if corridors were popular in the past just because of the effects of habitat fragmentation, now they're more popular because of the interacting effects of climate change. And so you see these big, bold plans emerging for creating corridors across landscapes. And so this is the cover of a report put out by the Western Governors Association, that is all the governors of the western states. And they've mandated for their states to create corridor plans for their entire states and region to keep landscapes connected. And so this is one of the results of a plan that I reviewed recently for the state of Washington. These are big plans that are trying to reconnect areas across the state for the key focal animals, mainly mammals, and keep the landscapes connected. Now, I'll come back to this in a while, but notice that the green areas here are already protected. A lot of Washington state is already protected. It makes challenge of reconnecting landscapes a little bit easier than in our eastern landscapes. But I'll come back to that, as I said. And there are these big plans like this. There are the road overpasses that I talked to you about earlier. Now I took this graphic, I had to show it from a display, a competition that was in the US Congress a month ago. And I think this was the winning design to create functional and aesthetic corridors for wildlife. And I love the artist's design of what their corridors will look like once it's used, with the animals running across. And then, as I said, close to my heart are the butterflies. Notice down in the corner, you got these two little butterflies using the corridor. Well, hopefully they work in such a way. What I've been building to is that these corridors are popular. They're being implemented in conservation. They're being promoted by conservationists. But the key question, of course, is, do these corridors actually work? And that's what this bear is wondering, as it's like jumping down off the road to run down some corridor in the landscape. Do they work? Are these corridors actually super highways for plants and animals? Do they allow plants and animals to spread across landscapes that are otherwise fragmented? And if they work as super highways, do they actually have consequences for conservation? Do they allow rare plants and animals to persist in the landscape? Do they increase the diversity of species? And that's what I want to address really quickly, and covering lots of ground that my lab has been involved in over the last almost 2 decades now. So I'll ask this question: do corridors increase dispersal? Are they superhighways for plants and animals? Do they increase diversity? And I'll tell you about an example focusing on plants. And the other question I'll ask is, do these corridors have potential negative side effects? Do they have are there potential dangers of going this route in conservation of making corridors? So, to ask all these questions, I'll tell you about an experiment that Jory worked in with me 10 years ago, and that I've been working on for a number of years. And this experiment is in South Carolina, and it's at the Savannah River site, which is basically a forested landscape. So this is pine plantation forest. And within the pine plantation forest, we created networks of patches and corridors to study the effects of corridors. And the basic gist of the design is we created patches that are 1 hectare in size, so like 2.5 acres, connected by to one patch by a corridor, which is about a football field and a half long, to another 1 hectare size patch. And then there's 3 isolated patches, that is, that aren't connected to anything. They vary in shape. I'm not going to tell you about those shapes because it doesn't really come into this talk. But the key point is we have this experiment that allows us to test for effects of corridors and compare the effects of corridors compared to places that are not connected. By the way, here you're looking at an oblique view of a landscape from a helicopter. If you looked at it straight overhead, this would actually be square. This would be more rectangular in shape. Okay, so we created our experiment by harvesting trees. This is a pine plantation forest. Cut trees to make our experiment. This is what ground zero looks like. But very quickly, native plants establish and native animals come into the landscapes. And we're pushing the landscapes toward longleaf pine savanna, that is, the native ecosystem that once occurred in these landscapes. And we do that by burning. Turns out that longleaf pine savannas were burned historically about once every 1 to 3 years. The Forest Service at our landscapes does controlled burning about every 2 to 3 years. And this is pushing the vegetation towards the native vegetation that once occurred there, like longleaf pine trees that you see in the picture, that are adapted to a very frequent fire regime. And so what our patches look like ultimately is they're moving towards longleaf pine savannas. They look like they have lots of grasses and flowering plants in them that are very diverse. And the patches and corridors themselves look a lot different than the plantation pine forest that is around them. The pine trees there are planted at such high densities that they exclude other plants and thus other animals, and so are really different from the patches and corridors where we work. Here we're looking from the forest out into one of our experimental patches that has this diverse and productive vegetation. Okay, so first I asked the question, do these corridors increase dispersal? And coming back again, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my butterflies. I started working out there on butterflies, and butterflies turn out to be a great study species to study dispersal at landscape scales. You can catch lots of them very easily. People ask, well, how do you mark a butterfly? It turns out the way you do it is with a Sharpie pen. You basically give them a barcode on their wings that gives them an individual code. You know where you mark them. You know where you recaptured them. And this is the kind of data we look at. I'm not going to show you too much actual data today, but I wanted to show you a couple slides that give you a sense for the data we're looking at. What we can do here is ask, well, what are the proportion of butterflies that were marked in one patch that moved to either a connected or an unconnected patch? And what the data show for this butterfly, the common buckeye, is that about twice as many butterflies move to connected patches than unconnected patches. That is, these corridors increase dispersal for the landscape. Or another way of saying it is they are highways for these butterflies. Now, we've worked not just with this one butterfly. We worked with a number of butterfly species, the variegated fritillary, the cloudless sulfur, sleepy orange. We've worked with other kinds of plants and animals. We've worked with fruiting plants. This is a holly. This is winged sumac, wax myrtle, and pokeweed. We've worked on pollination. Do these corridors help insects spread pollen through the landscape? And we've worked on lantana, holly, passion flower. We've worked with small mammals, which Jory worked on. We've now done 20 studies of detailed mark recapture of organisms, where we mark the organisms and then track them through the landscape. And for 18 of those 20 species, corridors increase dispersal. And so the point being that the effects of corridors are fairly general, and they're also pretty large. Corridors typically double or more than double the amount of dispersal through the landscape. Now, I do have to give a little bit of, tell you about species that don't use corridors, and there are a couple. Of all these species, we found one butterfly, the spicebush swallowtail, and one small mammal, the cotton rat, that don't seem to use our corridors. And these tend to be the biggest and most generalist species in their taxa. Now, I have to give you a little bit of truth in advertising here. When I first designed this experiment 17 years ago, the entire experiment was designed around this one butterfly, the spicebush swallowtail. We had gotten the Forest Service to harvest and set aside hundreds of acres of forest. I tried to control the distribution of the host plant for this butterfly, which is sassafras, spraying herbicides across hundreds of acres. I had tried to rear thousands of individual caterpillars to adult butterflies so that I could release individuals into our landscapes of known age. All for the one butterfly that didn't work, the one that didn't use corridors. And so I have to say, looking back, this was sort of one of these great learning experiences. Like I just thought I had a great plan and it didn't work, and I had to re-examine what I was doing. But still, it's a good lesson learned. Okay, so now the question is, I've demonstrated that corridors increase dispersal. Do they have consequences for populations and diversity? Well, now I'm going to tell you about work that was done on diversity of plant species by my former graduate student, Ellen Dampton. So Ellen went out there in 2000, set up 1,300 quadrats to study plant species diversity. So the quadrats look like this, although there's 3 of them, they're nested. That one's to study herbs, and then a little bit bigger one is used to study shrubs, and a bigger one to study trees. Set up 1,300 of these around the landscape. And I don't know if you can see this picture, but if you can tell by the big smile on her face that this is her first year of graduate school. But she actually continued working on in the experiment through her graduate years, and actually into the present day. We're still collaborating together. And I asked her to send me a picture, and she sent me this one from last summer, and she still has that big smile, so she ran the gauntlet of graduate school, still happy about doing ecological research. But with these data on plant diversity, she could ask, do corridors increase the diversity of plant species? I'm going to show you one other graph about effects on diversity. So what I'm showing you here is on the x-axis, the year from 2000 to 2010. On the y-axis, the effects of corridors on the number of plant species. And what I'm showing you is the difference in number between connected and unconnected patches. So if you go positive on the y-axis, that means more species in connected patches. And I present the data this way because there's a lot of variation that's caused by climate and weather from year to year. And a key point to make initially is that in the first year, right when our experiment was created, there was no effect of corridors on the number of species, which is good because we had just created our landscapes and we wouldn't expect there to be a difference without the effects of our landscape treatments to affect the number of species. But we measured, Ellen measured diversity year after year, and what she found is that very quickly, the number of plant species in connected patches increased relative to the number in unconnected patches, to the point where, by 2005, there were 20 more plant species in connected patches. Now, just to put this in perspective, there's about 100 plant species in these patches. So there's 20% more plant species in connected patches. These corridors had effects that were stronger and happened more quickly than I ever would have imagined. It was a clear demonstration that corridors were having consequences for diversity of species. Now, one other thing I wanted to tell you is that with regard to diversity and dispersal, we tend to focus inside the patches, like what's going on in the patches and the corridors. We had this postdoc come along and ask, well, what's going on outside of our patches out in the forested landscape? And the idea, the frame he put to this is, he wondered if the effects of corridors on diversity spilled over into the surrounding landscape. The idea is that if corridors are increasing diversity within the patches, that would provide more kinds of plants that could disperse, kind of slowly spread out into the surrounding area. And just to cut to the chase, he found that they do. These corridors increase diversity not just in the patches, but around our patches. Now this has huge implications for conservation because we'll never be able to protect the area that we like for conservation in protection alone. We just can't do it. We don't have the resources. And so if these corridors can have effects not just in, say, nature reserves, but in the areas surrounding nature reserves, we can get more bang for our buck out of these landscape corridors. Okay, last question I had to ask was, do these corridors have any negative effects? So we think of these corridors as having benefits. They become super highways for plants and animals. They increase diversity. But could they have unwanted negative effects? Could they spread fires or disturbances through the landscape? Might they increase the dispersal of antagonistic species like predators that predate species of conservation concern? Do they spread diseases around the landscape that might harm species of conservation concern? Well, about 25 years ago, there were some papers that came out that raised all of these concerns, and yet nobody addressed them. And it turns out we can now address them with our data from our experiment. So we can ask about how corridors affect the spread of predators or disease, whether they promote the dispersal of invasive exotic species, how they affect edges or boundaries in the landscape. I'll talk about that in a minute. And whether they can spread disturbances or catastrophes. I'm going to tick, like with one slide each, I'm going to tick through some of these negative effects. My students, former students, Brenda Johnson and Lauren Sullivan, asked the question about whether corridors could increase the intensity of parasites in the landscape. And they looked at parasites of plant species, plants that were of restoration interest, and their insight that they brought to this was to ask how different kinds of parasites that are dispersed differently, like these fungal parasites that are spread by wind or splash dispersed, are affected by corridors, or if they're dispersed biotically. So these are galling insects that create these galls on goldenrods. So they're insects. They're dispersed biotically, that is under their own power. And asked if these different kinds of species were affected differently by corridors. And what they found is that the wind-dispersed species weren't directed by the corridors and didn't have higher intensities in connected patches. But the galling insects, the insects that were able to disperse themselves and take advantage of those corridors, did have higher incidence in connected patches. Okay, second, we asked about whether corridors increase the spread of invasive species. So this is the same kind of graph I showed you earlier. Number of plant species, or difference in plant species between connected and unconnected patches on the y-axis over time. The graph I'm showing you now is for native species of restoration interest. And what it shows is that, similarly to all species, corridors benefit those native species. They affect the species that we care about in conservation. But then we looked at invasive and exotic species. Do corridors affect exotic species? And it turns out they don't. Corridors, the exotic species that are in our landscape either are found where they're planted, they don't move around the landscape, they're not invasive, or they're so invasive they don't need our corridors to get around the landscape. So I think this is more generally beyond our landscapes that corridors don't seem to have negative effects in conservation on invasive species. Now, another question that people ask is, do these corridors create edge effects? So the corridors tend to be these long, narrow strips. They create lots of boundary between the habitat that is being conserved and the surrounding habitat. And for those of you who are ecologists, you know that those boundaries create places that can be bad for conservation. They provide entry points for predators or diseases, entry points for invasive species. So these edges that corridors create could have negative effects. When my former student, Amy Weldon, asked about the effects of corridors on edge effects and on nest predation in indigo bunting birds. She focused on the nests and nestlings down here. And just to put a point on this, we have different kinds of experimental patches that are more edgy. So these ones with corridors and pseudo-corridors have lots of interface between our patch and corridor and the surrounding landscape. Then we have more compact patches that have less edge. Well, these indigo buntings are known as edge-loving birds. The older males, and we assume with birds that older means wiser, older birds select edgier patches. And we also banded these birds and found that about half of birds in the edgier patches returned to those edgy patches, whereas birds banded in the less edgy patches didn't like to return there. They like to be in places that are more edgy, but they did worse there. So this graphic shows fledgling success of chicks from nests. And even though the birds selected the edgier patches, the connected and the what we call our wing patches, they did worse there, fewer young were fledged, than in the more compact patches. And so this points to the fact that corridors can be these long, skinny places that create edge effects and might have negative effects on ecological communities. Okay, lastly, for our negative effects, people have worried that corridors might spread disturbances like fire. And we had a student, Stephanie Wagner, who asked about fire intensities and how corridors affect them. She put out these things called pyrometers. They're sticks with different paints on them that melt at different temperatures. Here's one where there's been some melting. And then could ask what the heat of fires are like in our landscapes. And she put out these pyrometers all through our landscapes and asked how corridors affect fire. This map shows the average fire temperatures at different points in the landscape, and it's a hard graphic to look at. So I just want to point you to two places. One is in the corridor, and one is in a similarly shaped area of the landscape, but that has this wing, this corridor that doesn't connect to anything else. And there's about a 30% higher temperature in the corridor. Those corridors do create hotter fires. But in our landscapes, hotter fires are actually beneficial. They favor the kinds of grasses that we want to restore in our landscape. So actually, corridor effects on fire has a positive effect. Okay, I want to just close with a few remarks, stepping back a bit. Our landscapes are big for ecology. They're among the biggest ecological experiments. But they're small from the perspective of real landscapes where people are doing real conservation. And so I want to talk to you just for a couple minutes about how we're thinking about landscape scale corridors in real landscapes, and also how we might think about them more generally in a regional or global context. So I'm going to come first back to those rare butterflies I told you about. This St. Francis satyr, the butterfly that occurs in abandoned beaver ponds at Fort Bragg. Well, the reason I got into this butterfly originally is because it lives in these wetlands along streams. It lives in, if we think about, this is my sort of caricature of the landscape. If there are habitats for the butterflies, like these wetlands, there are places that are wetlands that aren't occupied by the butterfly. This place is going to become bad at some point for the butterfly. Either a beaver is going to flood the area and the butterflies can't survive that, or the vegetation is going to succeed to forest and the butterflies can't survive that. They have to be able to move around the landscape. And when I got into this study, I was thinking that these corridors along streams may provide the superhighways that the butterflies need to get from one patch to another. And we found out to some extent that they do. And let's see, I think I'm going to skip this slide actually and tell you about, for the crystal skipper, this butterfly is the one that lived on sand dunes. It lived on this 30-mile stretch of sand dunes that is in coastal North Carolina from Atlantic Beach to Emerald Isle. And at one time, this was one long corridor for the butterflies. Now it's fragmented by urbanization, and the question is, do we need corridors to protect the butterfly, or can they survive in urban landscapes? And the good news is that the butterflies can use urban vegetation or semi-urban vegetation as long as people landscape with native vegetation. Stepping out a little further, beyond the sort of localized landscapes of butterflies, when I started off my talk, I talked about these big landscapes where corridors are being implemented. And one thing is I wanted to point out to you all, living here in Virginia, that I focused on mainly western landscapes, where lots of habitat is already preserved, and so it's relatively easy to think of ways to reconnect landscapes. What about in eastern landscapes? Well, people have thought about corridors for eastern landscapes, and they tend to be these sort of vague, idealized notions of where corridors might be, like down the spine of the Appalachians, or there's sort of a coastal plain in Florida through Virginia, areas that have been identified. But conservation there is trickier, and so it's going to take inventive minds to think about how we reconnect landscape for species in these highly fragmented and developed eastern landscapes. And it gets even more complicated if we step back further to places where people are thinking about corridors at an international level. Some of the most famous corridors out there are the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor, the Terai Arc, which is a set of conservation lands at the border of India and Nepal that's being conserved for tigers. And another famous example of proposals for corridors are the Paseo Pantera, the path of the panther, that is corridors to preserve jaguar populations. These become even more complicated. They're large in area. They deal with international boundaries and getting cooperation across countries to make connectivity work, but connectivity that's needed for the rarest and most endangered animals. And so, I want to just wrap up. I asked this question early on, do these corridors work? And the answer from our research and our experiments in natural landscapes is, yeah, they do work. They work to be superhighways for lots of plants and animals. And this is true not just in our experiment, but across now lots of scientific studies that have been done over the last few decades. Do these corridors have consequences for populations and for diversity? The evidence there is more limited. Our study on plants is one of the best examples that corridors can increase diversity. People ask whether these corridors might have potential negative side effects, and the answer there is that there's one that comes across clearly in our studies, and that is the possibility of the creation of these edge effects, that is, lots of boundaries between natural areas and the surrounding landscape. And the good news is, in wildlife management, we've thought about these edge effects for 100 years. So we know cases where we need to make wider corridors or make less distinct boundaries between corridors and the areas that surround them. And there's lots of work yet to do. We want to know about how corridors can work in conserving the rarest species, and whether corridors are the best way to preserve species in the face of a rapidly changing climate. These are areas that I'm excited to pursue in the future, and hopefully students like you all will think about conservation biology as an option for graduate school and tackle these problems as well. So I'll end up by just thanking a lab. I have a big lab group that involves lots of collaborators who are professors in various places around the country, and our graduate students and postdoctoral students, and lots of undergraduates like yourself who do lots of great work out in the field. And I will end by saying these corridors are found everywhere, and I will be happy to answer any questions you have either now or afterwards. I'll stick around and be happy to chat with you all. So thanks for your attention.